Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you all for joining us for the third of World Rowing's webinar series on safeguarding participants from harassment and abuse. I'm Jeff Powell. I'll be your moderator today. We're joined by, and I think some of you will remember her from the first two sessions, Annamarie Phelps, and she comes to us from the British Olympic Committee, the British Rowing, Safe Sport International, and a host of other relevant organizations. And Chris Perry from who's a World Rowing Development for Asia, the head coach of rowing at the Hong Kong Sports Institute, and the chair of the Asian Rowing Federation. Thank you both for joining us. For those of you who are familiar with the format, we will also be joined in the second half of our discussions by Sandy Kirby, who you will have met earlier in the sessions as well. Hi, Sandy. Now, first of all, a few housekeeping items. We're going to change the format slightly from what you might have been used to a few very short clips prepared by some of our colleagues around the world, followed by a brief discussion. Then in the second half, we'll enjoy the same sort of conversation you will have seen previously. For that portion, please enter any questions you might have in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And I'd ask you please to avoid any identifying information in your questions. If there are individual concerns, there's email address safeguarding@worldrowing.com that you're welcome to submit those to, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'd like to keep it quite general. Also a note that this session will be recorded. And just by way of, warning sounds a little strong, but there are some topics that we might be discussing today that may be sensitive, may be triggering. Again, if something is upsetting to you or your colleagues, please feel free to reach out offline or just step away for a few moments and collect yourselves. The final thing I'll say on this point is that for many of us, this is we're new to this game. We're not experts in this space as our panelists are, and we may not always know how to ask a question in the right way, and we want to encourage people to ask anyway, and that there is very much permission and space to not quite get it right in the questioning. So, having said all of that by way of preamble, we do have a couple of videos that you may have seen if you were in attendance on the first two sessions. The first from Jean-Christophe Roland, and the second from Dr. Richard Budgett from the IOC. Ludwika?
Dear rowing friends, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to these webinars on the subject of safeguarding. World Rowing believes that it's a fundamental right of all individuals with world rowing to be able to participate in a non-violent, safe and respectful environment. Harassment and abuse should have no place in society, and especially in the world of sport and in rowing. But the sad reality is that harassment and abuse occurs across all sectors of society and across all sports. As you will hear in the next video clip from the IOC Medical and Scientific Director, Dr. Richard Budgett, by the way, a 1984 Olympic gold medalist in the men's Coxed 4. World Rowing acknowledges its duty of care in this regard, and is committed to creating and supporting the environment and a culture free of harassment and abuse. The welfare of all participants involved with world rowing is paramount. Behavior and actions that constitute harassment and abuse cannot be tolerated, and safeguarding participants is the priority for us. And it is the responsibility of all involved in rowing: the council and commission members, leaders of member federations, officials, athletes, coaches, entourage, organizing committees. We each have a responsibility in this regard. At the beginning of 2018, we established a safeguarding working group whose role has been to develop for our organization a policy and procedures in that matter. The FISA safeguarding policy and procedures were approved by the Council and came into effect in February 2019. Since then, the Safeguarding Working Group has implemented initiatives to raise awareness of harassment and abuse and to educate our communities on how to create a safe environment to all participants. I must say that the Athletes Commission has been at the heart of this work since the outset, supported by the Sports Medicine Commission, and has been instrumental in the development of the policy and procedures, and equally in the communication on these matters across the athlete community. Again, everyone in our sport, each of us, has a responsibility to ensure the participants in rowing are safe and protected at all times from harassment and abuse. So thank you very much for participating in the World Rowing Safeguarding webinars, and I hope that you will find them useful. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Richard Budgett, the Medical and Scientific Director of the IOC. Now, in 2016, the IOC convened a consensus meeting of experts on prevention of harassment and abuse in sport. And they published the conclusions. And these conclusions are that it's incumbent on every stakeholder in sport to put in place safe sport initiatives, including appropriate policies and procedures, because it's our duty to enable every athlete to be respected and also to prevent the risk of non-accidental injury. The IOC takes safeguarding very seriously, and as a result have put in place a toolbox which is constantly updated with videos, with documentation, with training for the use by international federations to help them in this really important area.
So just as a recap of what we saw and heard in webinars 1 and 2, we discussed some definitions around what safeguarding is and isn't, some of the research that Sandy, Annamarie, and others have done and are doing in this space. And the session today is really geared towards what can federations do by way of policy and procedure and by way of environment or culture creation to move this from theoretical to practical within their organizations. Just a reminder that when we talk about terms like safeguarding, what we're really talking about here is proactive, preventative measures that cease or prevent these sorts of behaviors from happening within your organizations. Athlete and child protection tends to be much more reactive, right? A case has come forward and how do we go about dealing with it? So with that by way of introduction, we're going to begin with a few very short videos followed by some commentary from our panelists. Beginning at the beginning, what if you are an organization that really is at stage 1 of this journey? What does that look like? What sort of thoughts might you engage in at this time? So Ludwika, if we can roll the clip from our colleagues in the Philippines, please.
Hello, Jessel. Thank you very much to talking to us today about the steps you are taking to begin safeguarding discussions in the Philippine Rowing Federation. Okay, first question. What made you start to think about this topic recently, and why did you feel you need to take this action?
There was this incident during the 2019 Southeast Asian Games held here in the Philippines, which reminded me of something similar that happened in the past. So it served as a timely reminder for me on why we need to have safeguarding measures in place, not just during events, but also within our federation. So after we got elected last January 2020, One of the things we did was to reach out to you. If you remember, we sent you an email asking if ARF has any activities planned related to safeguarding.
Yeah, I remember that. I mean, I always know that where to start can always be a challenging. So what were the first steps that you took to get things moving?
We were doing a series of webinars last year for our athletes and coaches. We figured it was a good opportunity for us to include the safeguarding topic. So we reached out to Chris Perry to ask if he would be willing to conduct a webinar on safeguarding for Asia. Before this, we had a collaboration also with another Philippine Sports Federation, and we wanted to continue on this track, the collaboration thing. So we decided to open the webinar, Chris Perry's webinar, to other federations as well, not just in Philippines, but also from other countries.
How's the feedback from the webinars that you ran, and were you pleased with that?
Yes, actually, we were very surprised with the turnout. We had about 68 attendees, consisting of athletes, coaches, officials, administrators, and national and world rowing umpires as well. Not just from the Philippines, but also from Hong Kong. There were so many from Hong Kong, Japan, Myanmar, and Thailand. And we also had attendees from other local sports federations like Muay Thai, rugby, and Kendo. And some of the attendees also asked some questions that are really interesting. So, and I think it suggests that there's a growing interest on the topic of safeguarding here in Asia.
Yeah, it sounds very, very encouraging, though. I think, what do you think that was your next step thinking about?
The next step for us really is to build on where we started. Our NOC is actually currently working in the process of creating a Safe Sport Commission, and we want to get involved with that. As Chris Perry mentioned in the webinar, it's important to network with authorities and organizations that can help us on this. We would also like to continue collaborating with ARF and other federations that may have already a safeguarding policy and management system in place, and perhaps learn from their experience so we can set up our own too.
Well, thanks very much. Chris, it sounds like you were intimately involved in some of these discussions that transpired. What do you think about, or what advice would you give for organizations that are really starting out on this journey of safeguarding?
I think, of course, the first and foremost piece of advice is start somewhere. It's not possible, to create from nothing at a moment's notice an entire system for safeguarding. And I think what the Philippines did was a really good starting point, because they initiated a conversation and they opened it up very widely to involve as many people as they could. And I think that was a really good initiative, and it came from the top of the federation. So they were a newly elected board. Jersil, who you saw speaking, was the newly elected Secretary General, and she decided that something had to be done in that area. She reached out to people who she hoped would be able to provide more detailed input. But I think what's really good is that, they could have held that seminar just for the Philippines Rowing Association, but they were very broad-minded about it, and they not only invited other rowing federations from around the region, but they also invited other sports. They didn't just focus on athletes, but they invited officials, they invited umpires. And so in the end, we were able to start with a really good conversation, I think, about safeguarding and about the issues and topics which relate to it. And people were able to ask questions and to get information on some of the key starting up areas. So I think it was a really good way just to begin by starting a conversation and by involving as many people as possible, and then starting to talk about how to build a network where you are supported. and to do that before any case or anything arises. And I think the other thing that I would bring out was that we had a look very closely at what are the agencies or organizations or groups that can help in this kind of area, and how can you network with them before you need to use them. And of course, you know, we start always with law enforcement for dealing with serious cases, but there are many, many other organizations. Government social welfare organizations are one. In Hong Kong, for example, we also work with the Equal Opportunities Commission. Then there are many NGOs who have very specialized and high levels of expertise in child welfare, in protection, in the protection of women. We have in Hong Kong, for example, Plan International, which is an organization which deals with the welfare of children. Many people know, and Annamarie is directly involved, and so is Sandy with Safe Sport International. So there are plenty of organizations to reach out to. And I think this is really the starting point. And I think that's something that was done very, very well in this way. And we can come on later to talk about some of the questions that came up. But as a starting point, I think that was a great start.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. I think the point about both creating a network, but also that there is a network that exists out there that can be tapped into. And in addition to our conversation later, we will post some resources for organizations to take a look at in this vein to start to build out their network of contacts and allies in this space. Now, so that's the look at an organization just starting out. Ludvika, if we can roll our next clip from New Zealand, we can look at a little different angle on this topic.
Hi, I'm Simon Peterson. I'm the Chief Executive at Rowing New Zealand. I have with me Sonia Walker, the Rowing Manager at Rowing New Zealand. We want to share with you a few initiatives and ideas that we have been working through with our safeguarding policy. It is about our culture and our environment and doing the best by all of our people, but particularly our young people who deserve to be in a safe and well-guarded environment to complete their sport activities. So we have policy in place, which you're welcome to download from our website. That policy has been signed off by our board, and beneath that we have procedures that Sonia will talk through how and why we did those procedures. There's obviously a legal framework and an HR requirement around the people that you engage around your young people that has to be considered also. Sonia, how did we get to where we got to today with all your good work that you've done in the procedural area of safeguarding?
Yeah, so we started with our risks, really, identifying across our organisation and our member clubs what the major risks were for young people in our sport. We then looked at a broad range of other sports in our country and overseas and what they were doing, just to get an indication of the standard out there. We went to our government agencies to, once we'd established a draft, to get an audit done so that we at least were covering off that legal framework requirement. And then we developed the procedures. And those procedures and practical steps really related to the rowing specifics. So really trying to drill down to what does that mean in our sport on a day-to-day kind of nature. And that really cross-referenced back to our risks, and had we covered off all those risks within those new procedures. We then set up a template for our clubs so that the rollout of it would be adopted across our sport. And that's available also on our website. And really, I guess the biggest message from us is at least just start, make a start somewhere, because nothing is worse.
And in this world of athlete welfare and well-being and the change in that environment, you can't unknow something. Once something's been brought to your attention, you do need to have a framework by which you operate. And I know many of you on this webinar will realise from a management perspective that you've got a process to follow, not just the legal framework, but your own internal processes to protect your own people, yourselves, and your members. So we look forward to you making use of our resources that are on our website, and we wish you well in work you do in the safeguarding area. It is a very important area going forward.
Great. So Annamarie, our colleagues from New Zealand make mention of a number of items there. I think we heard reference to a networking piece, the obligation to consult with other parties, and establishing a framework. We also heard an encouragement to just get started. One point that we talked about offline about focusing on, though, and there was brief mention made of HR and recruitment practices. And I just wonder if you have some thoughts there, thoughts on the broader clip we just saw. Oh, Annamarie, I think you might still be on mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Jeff. I thought that was a really good piece. It was packed full of really helpful hints and things to do for a short 2-minute clip. And I think the things that I really picked up on that were, I'll come on to HR requirements, but especially about making it specific for your sport and your organization. So, you know, it's great to have these networks and support and template policies, but it's also really important that you make sure that they are written in a way that is relevant to the people that are in your organization and they make sense. So if you take your policy from a local football club or a local basketball federation, you know, just making sure that it's relevant to the riverbank, to the water, to the environment you're working in, that you use the right terminology so that people can really use it and understand it is key. And then on the HR requirements, of course, this is really important. I mean, Simon talked about creating the environment and creating the right culture. But alongside that, it is really important to have the framework to make sure that you're protecting people. So, you know, when somebody new comes in, a new coach or a new member of staff, you, as an organization, as a member federation, you really have a duty to make sure that that person is going to act in the way that you expect them to and to the standards that you expect, and is going to fit in with the culture that you're trying to create. And you know, I think even more than that, it's important to make sure that you haven't missed something in their background. So 99.9% of people are going to be good, well-meaning, great coaches that are going to turn up on your doorstep. But if you miss the one who has a history of safeguarding concerns in previous roles, then you're going to find yourself in trouble. And you're putting your athletes and the people that work for you at increased risk. And so you have to do something about that. And that's not a difficult thing to do. You know, you may be able to do police checks, depending on which country they come from and which country you're in. But actually it requires you just to pick up the phone to the people they used to work for, check out their CV, look at where they worked before, and have a conversation and ask the right questions. Find who they worked with before, maybe find athletes they worked with previously and just ask them about, you know, what they're like to work with. Ask their previous employer if there's any reason why they wouldn't re-employ that coach to work with vulnerable young people or elite athletes or para athletes. And I think, you know, if you do that, then you'll put yourself in a good position in terms of future recruitment.
That's great. Thanks very much, Annamarie. And you know, the only point I'd add is there's occasionally a challenge with privacy concerns when we call former employers, depending on what your HR legislation is in your jurisdiction. They may not be able to disclose some of these items. The only other thing we've been advised in our hiring procedures is when we're having these interviews and these discussions is that there are questions that we can ask to indicate to the candidate that we are likely to be a highly vigilant organization, and if they are someone predisposed to these behaviors, they are not likely to find a safe home within our organization. Great.
I'd agree with you, Jeff, but I still think that you can ask whether or not somebody would be prepared to take that person back into their organization. You could ask them if they've got any concerns about, you know, so these things are not disclosing something that happened previously, but you mustn't be frightened to ask the question. And if people just say, I'd rather not answer that question, then you've got a good reason, for example, to look a bit closer again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on to our colleagues from Algeria. Ludwika?
Le début de notre expérience dans le safeguarding a commencé quand nous avons pris part, moi et le président de la fédération, à la coach conférence de la FISA et la conférence des fédérations en 2019. C'était un sujet très important, d'actualité et qu'il fallait absolument le traiter et l'intégrer dans le plan stratégique de la fédération. On a commencé à l'implémenter à tous les niveaux avec la collaboration de Mehdi Galidi, représentant de la FISA en Afrique. La première initiative était de l'intégrer dans le programme du collège technique des entraîneurs qui s'est déroulé en 2019 afin de sensibiliser les entraîneurs et responsables du club sur l'importance du safeguard. Parallèlement à cela, nous avons apporté des amendements au règlement intérieur des équipes nationales afin d'intégrer le safeguarding ainsi que d'autres points. On travaille actuellement afin d'inclure le safeguarding dans les règlements généraux et les règlements des compétitions de la fédération, en incluant tout un chapitre qui traite le safeguarding dans le détail et mettre en place une structure de procédure. Sur le plan de la formation aussi, la formation des entraîneurs, le module a été intégré dans les différents niveaux de formation d'entraîneurs en aviron. À court terme, on projette d'organiser un séminaire consacré exclusivement au safeguarding avec la participation de tous les acteurs de l'aviron algérien.
So I found this a very powerful video in terms of the efforts that Algeria has made to embed this throughout their organization, right? It's in their technical conferences, it's with their national team, it's in the rules of racing, it's in coach education. Annamarie, I wonder if you can talk about how we work to change or impact culture and environment by touching all areas of an organization.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, again, I thought this was a great little clip in terms of setting out what Algeria have done. And, you know, being able to embed their safeguarding policy throughout every aspect of the work that the Federation does has meant that they are truly sharing responsibility for creating that safe sport environment across everybody. You might think that it's not necessary to do that, but I think that if you can do that, it will help to expedite or speed up cultural change, because it's only by putting framework and guidance and rules in place that we can change people's behaviors long term. And people will just not, you know, it just slips back, or they forget, or they do whatever's easiest, what people are familiar with. So you know, I think it's been interesting to see of all these videos, the beginning of the discussion, the introduction of rules, and then the embedding of those rules right the way through. And Algeria have brought us to the next step, which is adding it into the training and educational framework, so that people that are coming into the sport new as well are going to grow and are going to develop that. So yeah, they've done a great job, and I do think it's critical to be able to make sure it's not siloed. It's not one person's job. It's got to be everybody's responsibility.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Annamarie. Now, we're going to shift to our colleagues from Ireland and talk about a couple of other nuances, impacts on our development of safeguarding policies and procedures. Ludwika?
At Rowing Ireland, we are committed to safeguarding, and have been for a number of years, and for protecting our young and vulnerable members. And in January 2019, we adopted the Governance Code of Ireland. The Governance Code of Ireland is a code of compliance for sporting organisations in this country. And this has been led here by Sport Ireland, which is our overseeing body for sport in this country. And Sport Ireland have insisted that all national governing bodies comply with this code by December 2021, or their funding will be reviewed. Of course, safeguarding is a critical component of this code. And it's, in addition to this, good practice for any organisation. And although the process is laborious, it's so worth starting the journey to ensure an organisation is compliant with good practice. In fact, the Governance Code states to make sure safeguarding and the promotion of the organisation's reputation is dealt with in the communications and risk management strategy. and to ensure policies are in place to comply with other relevant law, for example, child protection. It was a journey we undertook, and it was difficult due to our small staff base as an organisation. We were lucky that this was led by one of our board members, Brenda Ewing. Brenda worked with Sport Northern Ireland and Children's First to ensure that we were compliant, and we still have more work to do on this journey. As a national governing body in 2 jurisdictions, we need to adhere to both laws. So in the south of Ireland, we need to ensure by law that our members are vetted by the local police, whereas in the north of Ireland, which is under the jurisdiction of the Northern Ireland Assembly and the UK government, it is highly recommended. We will continue this governance and safeguarding journey, particularly over the next number of months in lockdown, and support clubs with workshops on governance, safeguarding, and a big focus on coach education, as this marries and knits with the importance of safeguarding, good coaching practices and recommendations. We hope to launch a medal certificate for our clubs to award them for their hard work in good practice, and it'll enable them to run more effective clubs. The journey for us in clubs is just beginning, and we will support them on the journey. We've seen the importance of complying with safeguarding, good practice and governance for national governing bodies. And we know it's critical now for our clubs also, particularly with the link to funding. But not only that, to protect our sport and our members. And therefore I would encourage everyone to start this journey for the benefit of our sport.
So, Chris, we'll slide back to you on this one, and there were a couple of items made mention of there. One was that sometimes this can be a top-down imposition by broader government or other organizations that exist above our member federations. One. The other one is that in addition to the moral and ethical obligation, there is a reputational risk at play here. And I wonder if you can speak to one or the other or both of those.
Yeah, I think this is a really crucial aspect as we start to come into or moving away from the putting of policies in place to what happens when or if a safeguarding incident occurs and how an organization will deal with that. And reputational risk can become one of the biggest blocks to being able to effectively implement the policies that you put in place. And it was a question which came up repeatedly at the end of the seminars which I ran for the Philippines Rowing Association. People said, oh, but what happens to the reputation of the organization if one of these cases becomes public? How do we keep it confidential? How do we avoid damage to the organization? And of course, we know that in some of the biggest safeguarding cases around the world, those in the US gymnastics, there was a case in college football, we saw that reputational risk was the thing which prevented cases going forward quickly and being handled quickly. And it was the thing which led to a large number of young people in the case of these events being damaged for a long period of time, more and more, and for the perpetrators to be able to hide. And the reason was that when an incident was drawn to the attention of the authorities who had all of the necessary safeguarding policies and so on in place, their first questions were, are you absolutely sure? Do you really want to do this? Have you considered the consequences? What will happen? How embarrassed will we be? How embarrassed will your teammates be? What will happen to our coaching team? What will happen to our sponsors? So organizations sometimes run into the problem of balancing the moral side and the business side of the case. And I think that the message we have to get across is that there is a positive moral side, of course, but there is also a positive business side to dealing with these incidences early and quickly and promptly. And not only is it for the protection of all those involved, but it is also for the protection of the whole system. Yes, at first, if you have to handle such a case, you may face a lot of problems. But what if you don't? And I think we've seen very clearly where people do not handle those promptly and they become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, that at the end of the day, the damage is far more significant. And for people coming into that organization, who would you rather work for? Who would you rather row with? Who would you rather share your time and your experiences with? And of course, you would like to do it in a safe place with a positive culture. So I think we always need to explain that there is a positive moral case and a positive business case in terms of dealing with these cases promptly and effectively, and not to allow the fear of fallout to be a way of not proceeding. And it's not only in sport. We see now there are cases at the moment in the Australian Parliament. Some people may have seen this, where, you know, reputational risk has prevented women coming forward from a culture of, you know, abuse. And it happens time and time again. So, oh, don't do it because it will upset. So I think this is the message I want to get across, is that reputational risk is not a reason to avoid pursuing safeguarding cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Annamarie, it looks like you're eager to jump in.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because what Chris says is absolutely right. But I think there is also another dimension to this. And it is a fear that if we start to talk about safeguarding and start to put policies in place, that there will be a tsunami of cases that will hit a federation with people, with all sorts of things. And I'd love to be able to say that that's not going to happen, but it really quite often does. So as soon as we do start to think about this, people will start, athletes and coaches will start to think about things they have seen before, they've seen previously, a while ago, or they're seeing at the moment that they never thought before might be safeguarding cases. And they may well be an increase, a very rapid increase in the number of cases that come to a federation. And that is perfectly normal. It is perfectly normal to see that response, and it will subside and reach a level. And some of those cases may be very serious, and some will be people testing the water to see, am I understanding this right? But you can't say that there isn't going to be a moment where it feels like, you know, an awful lot is going wrong, because that is very typical when federations or institutions introduce new policies of this sort.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said by both of you. We're going to slide into our final set of videos from Brazil here. Before we do, thank you to those who've posted already in the Q&A. We will transition after that into our more open discussion. So if there's been a question or an idea that's been percolating, by all means, insert it into the Q&A, and we will make sure we get it answered in our more open and flowing discussion. Ludwika, if you can roll the Brazilian video, please.
Olá, meu nome é Marcelo Varrialho, eu sou gerente técnico da Confederação Brasileira de Remo. E eu vou explicar um pouco como foi o nosso processo inicial de implantação de um programa de prevenção ao assédio aqui no Brasil. Nós começamos a discutir isso em fevereiro de 2019, dentro da Confederação Brasileira de Remo. Levou mais ou menos 3 meses para a elaboração da documentação, discussão, aprovação dos textos e iniciar a implementação. Um dos pontos mais importantes que nós utilizamos foram as redes sociais, para divulgar essa mensagem de uma maneira mais simples e mais abrangente também para todo o universo de praticantes do remo e pessoas que trabalham com remo também no país, atingindo atletas, técnicos, dirigentes, clubes e federações também. Um ponto muito importante é que isso não demanda muito recurso, não custa dinheiro para a federação para implementar, só precisa de uma boa política de governança. Inicialmente nós somos incentivados pelo Comitê Olímpico do Brasil dentro do processo de melhoria das federações nacionais, através da governança e através também da implantação de melhores práticas esportivas que com certeza mudam a cultura do remo no nosso país. Nós também incluímos a capacitação com esse assunto nos cursos de técnicos, então hoje existe um módulo sobre prevenção ao assédio dentro dos cursos nacionais. E nós também criamos termos de adesão para cada atleta e para cada técnico quando eles são convocados para participar da seleção brasileira. Nesses termos existe também assuntos sobre comprometimento na prevenção ao assédio e ao abuso em qualquer tipo de atividade dentro da seleção brasileira.
É muito importante a gente falar sobre assédio em ambientes esportivos, principalmente quando a gente está tratando de crianças, pessoas menores de idade, porque é um assunto que não deve ser evitado. Quando ele é evitado, não tem denúncias, as pessoas não entendem a gravidade do problema. Quando as pessoas entendem o que se trata, o que é certo, o que é errado, elas podem se pronunciar. Então, se a gente fala sobre assédio, treinadores entendem o assunto e levam a sério, as futuras gerações elas vão ter muito mais perspectivas no esporte e de se manter dentro do esporte. Então, acho que é muito importante a gente sempre falar e estar aberto a esse assunto e também respeitar os outros.
Oi, meu nome é Letícia, eu sou treinadora de remo há 5 anos. Hoje trabalho junto com a Confederação Brasileira nas categorias de base. E quando nós falamos sobre prevenção de assédio e abuso, nós temos que entender que a primeira coisa que impera é o respeito. Quando existe respeito de treinador para com treinador, de treinador para com atleta e atleta para com treinador, não vai existir nenhum tipo de preconceito, não vai existir abuso e não vai existir assédio. Então a dica que fica é que todos se respeitem, para que a gente consiga construir um remo mais forte.
So, love that set of videos because it strikes me as really aspirational, right? This is the future we want to create. And so why don't we start there is, I guess for Annamarie and Chris both, what is it that an organization can do to begin to put in place that kind of structure so that, as we just heard, future generations are able to speak and act and participate in this sport more freely in this realm of safeguarding?
Do you want me to?
Go ahead, Annamarie. Sorry.
Well, it was really interesting throughout this series. We've heard the use of the word respect an awful lot, and it was picked up again here in the Brazilian one, particularly with the athlete and the coach, and having that environment where you do have respect between people and they can openly talk about their concerns and where they see risks is really important. So I think having that opportunity, and sometimes maybe even forcing that opportunity to talk, is quite good. So if you have if you want to bring this into the everyday life of your federation, making sure once a year there is an opportunity, an induction, or maybe a one-to-one between coaches and athletes where there is a safe space and you can talk about what are the things you're going to be doing this year, where are the safeguards that the athletes need. And we've seen this done really well in certain places. There's a really good program in America run by Keith Kaufman around creating situational prevention of abuse by having somebody independent go into a group and actually just talk to them about what are the things that you'd like to see, what are the risks that you perceive to be for you, whether you're an athlete or a coach or a parent as well, or an administrator. So getting everybody to input to that as well is helpful. And just starting, as we've heard lots of times, starting that conversation, but critical that you include the athlete voice in there.
Yeah, I mean, I would come in also on that and say, I think to use a term which Sandra has used before, which is about co-creation. And I think that's the idea that people really join together to create the culture that they want. And I think this was also brought out by Coach Johan Flodin with the Norwegian team in the previous seminar, when he talked about sitting down with the coaches and the team at the beginning of the season and saying, what type of culture do we want in our team? What is the culture that the Norwegian rowing team will have? And it wasn't just about safeguarding, it was about the day-to-day culture of the team. But I think it's a great opportunity to cover a very broad range of topics, because sometimes we tend to narrow in on the sexual abuse or the more serious aspects of safeguarding. But very often they start from small seeds, and that can be online bullying, misuse of social media, a bullying culture within the team itself. And those things can grow into bigger things. So I think that idea of having a conversation about what it is we want and co-creating the environment is a really good thing.
Great.
And I'd add to that, Chris, that you know, once you then have decided what are those sorts of things, you can then formalize those and make them part of your code of conduct or your guidance. And then they have some longevity and they have a little bit of kind of strength, and they can be as much a carrot as a stick, you know, to try and get people to stick to. Quite often we see that safeguarding initiatives, and we've seen through these videos, are they're started by the enthusiasm of one person. There's usually often a single person who drives them through, and that's quite necessary because you need someone with that commitment. But unless you then embed those in the policies and procedures and across your federation, when that person moves on or when they change their role, then you will lose all of that knowledge. So being able to make sure that you capture those sorts of things and make them happen so that they happen on a regular basis, and so they're very much embedded, is actually critical at quite an early stage. It doesn't mean they're set in concrete. You can continue to evolve them, but you just need to begin to put some foundations down about what is acceptable.
I think that's
I think also just to identify people who really care about it, and, you know, some athletes, some officials, some umpires, some coaches, and to make them part of that process, and, you know, find people to be, if you like, spokespeople, mentors, those kind of things.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment about balancing the identification of champions versus making your system a little bit agnostic to that individual or individuals. I do want to just tug on this thread about athlete voice a little bit, and I wonder what advice you may have. And Sandy, maybe I'll invite you to jump into the conversation about how we go about including the athlete voice, right? It is clearly an important element of this, but what are some best practices that we've seen around ensuring that it is included in the best possible way?
Yeah, well, I'll make a start maybe, and I'm sure the other two will have lots to say, but we've developed a lot of policy and procedure without actually asking the athletes what is it they need and what works for them, and what roles do they have or do they want to play in it. So one of the things that we could do, for example, is establish an athlete committee. If you don't have one, establish an athlete committee and have them be part of your safeguarding effort in a real way, not just a sounding board, in a real way of creating it. Another thing you could do is talk to athletes about what roles they would like to play and then enable those. So if they want to get engaged in safeguarding, but they don't have enough training, how do you link them with the training opportunities that they might need? If they just need a network, how do you connect them with people who can help them be part of a network? If they want to be activist and speaking and so on, then help them get enough information and some of the tools to enable them to be good speakers to the audiences that they can reach. But first and foremost, we have to go and we have to talk with them about what it is they want and they need in this space. It doesn't mean they need to lead it, but they need to be certainly very much a part of how it's built. Annamarie, I'm sure you have something to add there.
Any additional thoughts?
I've always got something to add.
Always,
yeah. Yeah, I think one of the, I mean, as an example, one of the things that surprised us when I was safeguarding lead at British Rowing was, you know, we appoint the safeguarding officer, the safeguarding lead, who is the point of contact for young people or for athletes. But when you go to athletes and actually ask them anonymously to say who would they go to, you know, if they had a concern, a safeguarding concern, you'll find it's probably one of their peers. It'll be someone they really trust, their coach. It might be their parents. It certainly isn't somebody in a blazer in an office, or, you know, who they just don't relate to. So it's really important to understand how would they want to discuss things? How would they want to be heard? And you know, the school that I sit on the board of governors of recently, we brought the student leaders into the interview process for the designated safeguarding lead, so that they could meet all of the candidates and have a view on who they would like to approach, for example. So, you know, I think this bit of interface is really important. And I know our athletes at World Rowing events have felt very much that they are much happier to talk to athlete commission members, for example, in that environment than perhaps, you know, an umpire or an official, whereas officials may be happy to go to officials.
Yeah, I would endorse that as well. And I think it's something that, you know, on the world event level, I think it's something that World Rowing has done quite well, and that is involving members of the Athlete Commission in the safeguarding approaches, and having them, you know, around the dining room at meal times, around the hotel lobbies in the evenings, just to chat. And I think that athletes have certainly reflected to me that they would find it more easy to have that kind of discussion in those kinds of environments than to go and knock on, you know, some remote safeguarding door office and meet some unknown person in a blue blazer. And I think that that's really important, that how you create an environment that's conducive. I think the other thing is that, you know, we keep talking about coming at it two directions, which means from the direction of how we involve people in creating, and then, as Annamarie has said, how we embed it into policy. And I think also, I always want to go back also to the kind of stealth approach to safeguarding as well, and to say that when we talk about the cultural situation, you know, many of those things people may not at first associate with safeguarding, but just, you know, daily respect to each other, the way we treat each other, the way, you know, between the coach and the athletes we behave, what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate amongst peer groups of athletes, what kind of things we don't tolerate, you know, when people are weighing in. All of those kind of things create the culture which needed to underlie safety and make the environment hospitable in every sense. So I think also, as well as the sort of direct policies on safeguarding, always remember that culture underneath it is a kind of a stealth approach as well.
Wonderful. We've talked a lot about culture and environment, and I just want to give a final opportunity. We do have a question in the chat, sort of how we ensure that our policies, our words, transition into actions within our organizations. I'm just curious if there are any more thoughts from the group here on how we can ensure that effective translation from word to deed.
Well, I think it's probably about review. I mean, you know, it's one of those basic things that we do in a work environment, and we tend to forget sometimes in a sport environment, but reviewing that policy regularly and inviting athlete representatives and coach representatives in to look at it and to really understand and make sure that there's a version written in language that they can understand, so that, you know, they can say whether it's working or not. And I think not being frightened of that a policy is not something you write on a piece of paper and then put on a shelf. It has to be absolutely a sort of living document that you're prepared to regularly review and go back to and make sure it is working. So, you know, we've talked a lot about conversations and talking about safeguarding, but this continuing journey, this isn't a program you're going to do for 3 months and then finish it, put the lid on and put it away. This is a journey that federations and our sport needs to go on continuously now with, and just keep evolving and, you know, and coming back to around in a circle every now and then.
Yes, I think also the key point as well is that even when you have a very good policy in place, it's not worth anything unless there is an absolute commitment by the organization to act in the case of any need. And I think that obviously has to come from the top, and it has to be, you know, a complete, like, no tolerance policy. And I think everyone needs to understand that the organization can and will act if it has to. And I think that so often, you know, we see these great policies put in place, and then the first time something comes up, it's like, are you really sure? Do you think you should do anything? You know, that's the kind of question that stops the ball rolling forward and loses trust and confidence. So I think that also really understanding that. Some of the other questions that came up in the Philippines seminar were related to how can I be 100% sure? And the answer, of course, is that you can't be, and you still need to do something about it. And I think the other one was, I'm not really qualified, I don't feel qualified to investigate. And I think the answer to that is, you're not the investigator. You are there to listen, to not to put your own interpretation on it, and then to decide who to pass it on to, experts and so on. So I think those questions came up to me again and again, and I think that's also important. So the commitment to do something, and the understanding that there are people who will help you, who are professionals, and it is not your job to be the investigator or the police.
Thanks, Chris. In the interest of time, I want to try and squeeze in one quick question from the Q&A before we move into wrap up. And this relates to, I think, some of the small communities that we find in rowing, and maybe at the club level, certainly, but potentially even as we move into, you know, provincial or state level and national federations. How do we go about ensuring that the designated safeguarding lead is truly independent and objective in a world where, you know, a lot of us wear many different hats. A lot of our organizations have a heavy volunteer contingent for whom people are involved only because they are connected to the sport in some other way. So how do we ensure that independence given that structure?
It's a real problem, especially for small clubs in all countries. But what is really important is that it is critical that that person is independent and is seen to be independent. So, you know, you really can't have the wife of a coach as the safeguarding officer, or the brother of the Secretary General, or somebody who is closely interlinked, because they have an inherent conflict of interest that they just won't be able to act. You know, they will have been involved probably in the recruitment of coaches, or they may be somebody who's closely involved. So it is a challenge, and I absolutely agree that. But I think that there is a really strong case for this being a role where actually you can go outside your organization. In almost every community, there will be somebody who is a social services type person who works with people from vulnerable backgrounds, or there will be a teacher, or there may be an ex-policeman or a current policeman, or there'll be somebody who, you know, has a background that works in this sort of area, who can help and will be just one step away and can manage those cases for you. And I would say that that's where the direction to go in.
Yeah, I would totally endorse that as well. And I think, you know, really make use of the network, pre-establish that network before something happens. Don't try and establish it when you get a problem. And I think the other point to make is that, you know, some of these cases are extremely complicated and convoluted, but that shouldn't be a reason not to try to tackle them, or to push them to the side, or not to take action. So remember, safeguarding cases can be very complex, but still it's necessary to be willing to take action. And in the cases where action is not taken, that is the case where very often the worst harm occurs.
Yeah, and if I can just add one thing, you know, you always have World Rowing at your back. World Rowing has policies and procedures, and there is obviously some considerable safeguarding expertise, which will help your national federation and the clubs to make sure they're on the right path and they have good policies. And those, as Annamarie says, that the policies are reviewed. And as Chris said, the people who are engaged have to be excited and energetic around them. But you'll always have World Rowing at your back.
Thanks very much for that, Sandy. Now, I do want to give the opportunity for any final comments from the group here. I know you've each had a roundtable on that last one. Any final key takeaways that if people only take one or two items away from this discussion, what would you like them to take away? Maybe we'll start with you, Annamarie.
Oh, Jeff, that's so difficult. There's so many things I would love to be able to share with you. Can I have two or three?
As many as you like.
I would say that my key takeaway, please, is that this safeguarding is not rocket science. It is not difficult. It is about creating an environment with respect where people feel able to ask open questions. So just think about what sort of questions you want. I think keep it simple and keep it relevant is how you want your policy, and particularly the policy that the outward facing bit, to encourage people to engage. And partly to help answer a question that I think we haven't got round to, and partly because I think it is absolutely critical in creating a good culture, is there can be no untouchables. There must be nobody in your organization who is not held to account to your policy. So if there are people, wherever they are in that organization, if there is somebody who you believe is not acting in the best interest of the athletes or the individuals, then they should be reported. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
That's the phrase of 2020, 2021. Chris, one or two key takeaways for the group?
I think the biggest one for me obviously revolves around the question of, what if I do and what if I don't? And I think that very often people say, what if it's too complicated? What if I can't investigate? What if? And I would just turn that around and say, what if you don't? And I think that the tragedy and the business risk and the moral risk is far, far higher by not doing something, even if you're just making a small start, than it is by avoiding doing something. So just do it.
Yeah, very well said. Thanks, Chris. Sandy, the final word on to you here.
Yeah, I guess it's just one. It's that you don't have to build the resources from the start. World Rowing has a lot of resources. A number of organizations around you have resources, templates, and so on that are available for you. The IOC has their toolkit and a lot of information there. So you don't have to start from zero. There's a lot of work done that you can use. And my plea is always to be open to sharing that information, as World Rowing tries to do research and bring fresh data to this, that you're open to sharing some of it with us.
Wonderful, thank you. So by way of wrap up, let me start by saying thank you to the three of you for your time today and in advance of this session and all the sessions, for sharing your expertise and your passion and your care for this topic. I think we are all better for having spent this time with you. So thank you very, very much. For anyone watching who felt that they didn't get a question answered live, we are going to be preparing a written Q&A, and it will be published on the World Rowing website. You will also see a survey in your inboxes related to this session. Please take the time to fill it out. It does help us with future content and future direction. And so as much as we are encouraging you to begin on a journey that doesn't end after a week, please know that this is not an end point for World Rowing, and your responses to that survey will help determine next steps and direction. If there was anything you didn't get discussed today, feel free to join us again at 7 p.m. Central European Time, and we can do it all again and perhaps examine a couple of other questions if something comes to mind in the interim. If you do need further resources, Sandy referenced a couple of them on World Rowing, the IOC. Ludwika is posting a number of them on the screen right now for your reference. Beyond that, thank you all as participants for your interest and your concern in this topic. It's an incredibly important one, and we look forward to interacting with you again in the future. Take care, have a wonderful day, and stay safe.